The morning Eliza Calloway rode into Harlan Creek on the back of a borrowed mule with nothing but a carpet bag, a pair of worn-down boots, and a letter of employment clutched in her gloved hand. Not a single soul in that dusty Colorado town could have predicted that she would change everything about the life of the most solitary cowboy in the territory. The year was 1874, and the town of Harlan Creek sat like a stubborn old man in the shadow of the San Juan Mountains, a place that had survived droughts, cattle wars, and the kind of hard winters that broke lesser settlements entirely. The main street was a stretch of packed red dirt flanked by a general store, a blacksmith's forge, a saloon that smelled of pine pitch and old whiskey, a small church whose white paint had begun to peel away in long, sad ribbons, and a handful of storefronts that served the ranchers and homesteaders scattered across the surrounding land. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody else's business before they even thought to do it, and newcomers were studied with the focused attention of hawks watching something move through tall grass. Eliza was 24 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with a way of carrying herself that suggested she had once expected more from the world and had made a private peace with the fact that she had not received it. She was not fragile, and she was not soft, though she could laugh in a way that made the room feel briefly warmer. She had come from Pueblo, where she had spent the last 2 years keeping house for a widower merchant, and his 3 children before the merchant had remarried a woman who did not want another woman under her roof, however industrious and honest. Eliza had understood completely and had taken her wages and her dignity and left without ceremony. The letter in her hand had come from a posting at the general store in Pueblo, written by a man named Rupert Calloway, no relation, who ran the post office in Harlan Creek and served as a sort of informal employment broker for the outlying ranches. The letter described a position on a cattle ranch called the Double C, owned by one Cole Danvers, age 28, who needed a full-time housekeeper following the departure of his previous one. The wages were fair. The position included a private room above the kitchen. The terms were professional and straightforward. What the letter had not described was the ranch itself, which took Eliza's breath away when the mule crested the last rise on the narrow track leading out from town. It spread across the valley floor in a wide, unhurried sprawl. The main house, a 2-story structure of rough timber and river stone, with a wide covered porch running the entire length of its front face. Behind it sat a proper barn painted a deep red that had only begun to fade at the corners, 3 outbuildings, a stone-walled smokehouse, and a series of well-maintained corrals. Beyond the corrals, the land rolled outward in great golden sweeps of late-summer grass, and cattle moved across it in slow, dark clusters like shadows thrown by clouds. It was beautiful and it was lonesome in equal measure, the way a painting can be beautiful and make you ache at the same time. A man was coming out of the barn as Eliza guided the mule through the front gate. He was tall and lean in the particular way of men who work hard every single day of their lives, dressed in a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, dark trousers tucked into boots that had seen considerable use, and a hat that had once been brown but had been bleached by so many seasons of sun that it had become the color of old straw. He stopped walking when he saw her. He pushed his hat back on his head with one thumb, the way men do when they are trying to get a better look at something. His face was the kind that did not easily give away what was happening behind it, angular, weathered, serious, with a jaw that looked as if it had been carved and a pair of dark eyes that took in everything and offered back only careful study. This was Cole Danvers. He did not say hello. He walked toward her and stood at the mule's head and looked up at her with those dark, assessing eyes and said, "You're the housekeeper." It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that could, depending on your disposition, read either as rude or simply honest. Eliza had dealt with worse and had decided in approximately the time it took to climb down from the mule's back that she would read it as honest. "I am," she said, straightening her jacket and extending her hand. Eliza Calloway, I received your posting through Rupert at the General Exchange. He looked at her hand for one beat, then shook it once firmly. Cole Danvers, my ranch hand Hector will take your mule around. Come inside and I'll show you the room. He turned and walked toward the house. Eliza picked up her carpet bag and followed him, looking around as she went, cataloging the property the way a practical person catalogs a new situation, not romantically but carefully, with attention to what was present and what was missing. What was missing, she noted almost immediately, was any evidence of softness. The porch held 2 straight-backed wooden chairs and a coil of rope. The front room of the house contained a stone fireplace, a plain table with 4 chairs, a sideboard, and absolutely nothing decorative whatsoever. No curtains hung in the windows. No rug lay on the floor. No pictures occupied the walls. A rifle hung above the fireplace on 2 wooden pegs, and beside it, a calendar from the previous year had been left, apparently forgotten. It was the home of a man who had never learned to make a place feel like anything other than shelter. Cole showed her the kitchen, which was large and well-equipped in a functional sense. A good cast iron stove, proper shelving, a dry sink, and a back door that opened onto a kitchen garden that had been planted but not tended with any particular love. Then he showed her the staircase at the back of the kitchen and the room at the top of it, which was small but private, and had a window that looked out over the eastern pasture and caught the morning light in a way that immediately made it feel less small. Meals at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, he said, standing in the doorway. I have 2 hired hands, Hector Reyes and a man called Bud Ferris. They eat at the same table. Laundry on Mondays, mending as needed, the house kept clean and orderly. Anything requiring purchase from town, you give me the list and I'll arrange it. Any questions? Eliza set her carpet bag on the narrow bed and looked at him. Will you be requiring anything beyond what you've listed, Mr. Danvers? He seemed briefly wrong-footed by the directness of the question, though his face did not change in any dramatic way. No, he said, that covers it. Then I have no questions, she said pleasantly. I'll start supper. He left without another word, and Eliza stood in the small room for a moment, listening to his boots on the stairs, and thought that this was going to be an interesting kind of lonesome. She was not wrong. The first week at the Double C was a period of quiet, determined assessment on both sides. Eliza moved through the house like someone who understood that a space needed to be understood before it could be changed, and she changed nothing in those first days beyond what was strictly necessary for the work. She cooked simply and well biscuits and salt pork in the mornings, beans and whatever dried or pickled things the pantry held for the noon meal that she left covered for whoever came in, and proper suppers of beef stew or roasted chicken, or whatever game Hector brought in from the surrounding hills. Hector Reyes was 30 years old, broad-shouldered and quietly kind, a Mexican man who had worked the Double C for 4 years and had, in that time, developed a wordless but genuine loyalty to Cole that expressed itself in hard work and careful attention to everything the ranch required. He greeted Eliza with natural warmth, touched his hat on the first morning, and told her in his careful, precise English that the biscuits were the best he had eaten in the entire territory, which made her laugh and made him smile. Bud Ferris was different. He was 42, raw-boned and loud in the careless way of men who have never been asked to be anything else, and he treated the arrival of a woman on the ranch with a combination of suspicion and the kind of sideways, overlong looking that Eliza had encountered before and knew exactly how to handle. She addressed him without warmth but without discourtesy, set his plate in front of him exactly as she set the others, and made clear by the consistency and evenness of her manner that she was neither impressed by him nor unsettled by him, which was the most effective possible response, and one he gradually, grudgingly, accepted. Cole ate at the head of the table and said almost nothing beyond what was required. He said thank you when his coffee cup was filled. He said it again when his plate was brought. He answered questions when asked and offered no conversation beyond that. He was not rude. He was simply contained, in the way that certain landscapes are contained, the kind that seem closed off until you have spent enough time in them to understand that what looked like emptiness is actually a very full and very private kind of quiet. By the end of the first week, Eliza had quietly put up curtains in the kitchen window, simple muslin ones she had sewn herself from fabric she found, folded at the back of a trunk in the storage room, clearly purchased and never used. She had also found a braided rag rug in the same trunk and laid it in front of the fireplace in the front room, and had placed the potted geranium she had brought in her carpet bag on the kitchen windowsill. Cole noticed all of this. He said nothing about any of it. But on the second Friday morning, when Eliza came downstairs to start the stove and found that someone had placed a small stack of firewood beside the kitchen hearth, not the usual thing, which was that whoever wanted wood fetched it themselves from the pile out back, she stood there for a moment in the early dark and understood that something had been acknowledged. It was, she thought, a start. The weeks accumulated the way they do when you are working hard in a place that has its own rhythm, each day bringing its requirements and its small events, its weather and its particular light. The San Juan summer moved toward autumn with the unhurried certainty of a season that knows its own power, and the ranch deepened into the kind of work that the turn of the year brings with it. The final cattle drives to the north pasture, the laying in of winter stores, the mending of fences before the ground hardened. Eliza worked. She was not a woman who knew how to be idle, and the double C gave her plenty to occupy herself with. The kitchen garden had been planted in an optimistic but disorganized way by whoever had done it before her, and she spent her afternoons replanting what could be replanted and harvesting what was ready, filling the root cellar with the systematic focus of someone who had known a winter without enough food and had no intention of knowing one again. She put up preserves. She dried herbs. She made soap from the ash and fat that accumulated in the kitchen and stored it in the smokehouse. She repaired the curtains in Cole's study, which she had not been asked to enter but had peeked into enough to know that its single window had a curtain rod with nothing hanging from it. One evening in late August, she was on the porch after supper with her mending when Cole came around the corner of the house. He had been checking the fence line on the south pasture and came back later than usual, his shirt dark with sweat and his face carrying the particular blankness of exhaustion. He stopped at the porch steps when he saw her there. "Evening," she said, not looking up from the shirt she was mending. He came up onto the porch and leaned against the rail and looked out at the sky, which was doing extraordinary things in orange and deep rose over the mountains. He was quiet for a while, which was usual. Then he said, "The fence on the south side is going to need replacing before the first frost. I noticed the posts looked soft when I went out to the garden this morning," she said. "Do you have enough timber for it?" He glanced at her briefly, and she thought she saw something flicker at the edge of those dark eyes, not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Hector and I will take the wagon to the mill day after tomorrow. Should be enough time before the weather turns." "I'll have food packed for the road," she said. "It's half a day's drive, isn't it?" "About that," he said. The silence that followed was comfortable in a way that surprised her. She finished the seam she was working on and held the shirt up to check it against the fading light, and he stood at the rail and watched the mountains go dark, and the evening settled around them both like something neither of them had asked for and neither of them had thought to refuse. "Where did you come from?" he asked, abruptly, the way people ask questions they have been holding back for a while. "Pueblo," she said. "Before that, a Limosa. Before that, a small farm outside of Walsenburg that my parents worked until my father's lungs gave out." She said it plainly, without asking for sympathy or offering any self-pity. "I've kept house in one way or another since I was 15. He was quiet for a moment. "Long time. 9 years, she agreed, though some of those years were more instructive than others. "What does that mean?" he asked, and she noticed that his voice had shifted slightly, the way a closed door shifts when someone is deciding whether to open it. "It means," she said, folding the mended shirt neatly, that working for other people's households teaches you a great deal about what makes a home and what makes merely a shelter, and it's not always the things you'd expect. He looked at her directly for the first time that evening. She met his eyes steadily, the way she met everything. He looked away first. "I'll check on the horses," he said, and pushed off from the rail and went back around the house. And Eliza sat on the porch a while longer in the warm August dark and thought about the particular texture of loneliness in a man who lived alone by what he believed was preference, and had perhaps forgotten what the alternative felt like. September came with the smell of aspen turning on the high slopes, the leaves going from green to gold in that sharp, clarifying way that always makes the air feel cleaner and the days feel more important. Eliza had, by this point, transformed the interior of the Double C's main house in gradual, careful increments that altered the character of the place without disrupting its essential nature. The front room had curtains, now blue ones that caught the afternoon light and threw it in warm patches across the floor. The calendar from the previous year had been replaced by one for 1874, hung in the same spot, which Eliza felt was both practical and respectful of whatever habit had put the first one there. She had found a painting in the storage room, a landscape of mountains in a plain wood frame, and had hung it above the mantelpiece, and had stood back and decided it looked as if it had always been there, which was exactly right. Cole had come into the front room one evening and stood in the doorway and looked at the painting for a long moment and had said nothing, and then had sat down in the chair by the fire and read for an hour, which was the first time Eliza had ever seen him sit anywhere in the main room for any purpose other than eating. She had also, by this point, come to know certain things about him that you only learn through close daily proximity, and the kind of observation that isn't exactly intentional but happens anyway when you are paying attention. She knew that he drank his coffee black, and that he took it very hot, and would leave it if it cooled too much rather than complain. She knew that he rose before 4 o'clock most mornings, and that he stood on the porch in the very early dark for some time before he started his work, just standing there, which she had witnessed once by accident from her window and had not mentioned. She knew that he read proper books, not just almanacs and cattlemen's journals, though those too, and that the shelf in his study held a battered copy of Moby Dick and a volume of poems by Walt Whitman that looked considerably more handled than everything else. She knew that he was 28 years old and that he had owned the Double C for 3 years, having purchased it from the estate of a man named Aldous Crane who had left no heirs. She knew, through Hector, who mentioned it matter-of-factly one morning over breakfast, that Cole had come to the territory from somewhere in Tennessee as a young man of 20 with almost nothing, and had worked cattle ranches across 3 states before saving enough to buy the Double C, and that he had done it entirely alone. She knew that he had never, as far as anyone in Harlan Creek could tell, had a serious sweetheart. She knew this from Agnes Rupert, the postmaster's wife, who was the primary custodian of such information in Harlan Creek, and who had taken Eliza under her considerable wing from the first time Eliza came into town for supplies. Agnes was 50, cheerful, sharp as a tack, and completely without malice, which made her the rarest kind of gossip. "Cole Danvers is a good man," Agnes had told her over tea in the back room of the post office, which functioned as the social center of Harlan Creek for the women of the town. "He is decent and honest, and he always pays his bills, and he's never treated anyone poorly that I've ever heard of. But he is sealed up tighter than a mason jar in the middle of winter, and I have watched 3 very nice young ladies try to make some kind of impression on him and come away looking puzzled and a little humbled." She had paused and added, with the careful precision of someone making a medical observation, "He is not cold. He is just very, very private." Eliza had filed this information away without comment and gone home with her supplies and made supper and set Cole's coffee on the table and watched him read the newspaper that Hector had brought back from town, and had thought that Agnes Rupert was a perceptive woman. What Eliza did not examine in those early autumn weeks was the thing that was beginning to happen inside her own chest. She had not come to the Double C looking for anything except honest work and a dry place to sleep through the winter. She was a practical woman. She had a clear-eyed view of her own situation. A woman of 24 with no family and no property and no particular prospects beyond the ongoing necessity of her own labor. And she had constructed her practical life around this view with the kind of careful engineering that is sometimes mistaken for coldness, but is actually its opposite, the opposite being the recognition that warmth must be protected in order to survive. She was not looking for love. She was not even thinking about it. But the mornings in the Double C kitchen had a quality she had not encountered before. There was a particular quiet in the hour before the others woke, when it was just her and the stove and the light coming up over the eastern pasture, and sometimes the sound of Cole's boots on the porch. There was a particular quality to the evenings when supper was done, and Hector and Bud had gone to the bunkhouse, and the house settled into the sound of the fire and the wind and Cole turning a page in the front room. One evening in the middle of September, a storm came down from the mountains with almost no warning, the way the weather does in that part of Colorado, switching from clear and still to roaring in under an hour. The temperature dropped 20 degrees before the last of the light was gone. Eliza was in the kitchen garden when the first gust hit, and she came inside fast with her apron full of the last of the summer squash, and her hair coming loose and her face stung pink by the cold, and she found Cole standing in the kitchen doorway looking toward the barn with his expression set in the focused way of a man calculating what needs doing. "The horses are in," he said, without looking at her. "Hector got them before it turned. Bud's in the bunkhouse." "Good," she said, setting the squash on the table and going to close the back door, which the wind was already finding the edges of. "I'll put more wood on the stove. The flue needs adjusting or it'll smoke." He looked at her then, briefly, but with something she couldn't quite name, something like the look you give a person when they've said exactly the right thing. He crossed the kitchen and adjusted the flue himself, which she knew how to do perfectly well but didn't say, and the smoke cleared and the stove settled into a steady, deep burn. They made supper together, because there was nobody else, and the storm made the usual routine feel irrelevant. He cut the bread, and she made the stew, and they moved around the kitchen in a kind of unconscious choreography, neither of them making a point of it, the storm battering the shutters and the lamp throwing warm yellow light across the table. When they sat down to eat, it was just the two of them, which had never happened before, and Eliza poured the coffee and Cole said, "Thank you," in a different register than usual, lower and more present. The way you say something when you actually mean it rather than when you are simply observing courtesy. They talked during that supper. Really talked, not the brief exchanges of practical information that had constituted their communication up to that point. He asked about Pueblo, and she told him, not just the work but the place itself, the way the Arkansas River looked in the morning light, the smell of the smelters on the wind, the particular loneliness of being a woman alone in a town where everyone's story seemed to belong to someone else. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she asked about Tennessee, he paused for a long moment and then said, carefully, that he had left a situation that had not suited him and had found in the work of the land a kind of order and purpose that had made everything else make more sense. She did not push. She recognized a careful answer and knew how to leave it alone. "The house is better," he said after a while, and it took her a moment to understand he was talking about what she had done to it. "The curtains and the painting were in the storage room," she said. "I didn't bring anything that wasn't already here." "That's not what I mean," he said. He looked at the lamp on the table and then out at the storm-dark window and then at her. "It feels different, like somebody lives in it." The simplicity and weight of that observation landed on Eliza somewhere she had not been expecting, and she looked at her coffee cup and said, "That's what a home is supposed to feel like." He nodded once, and that was the end of that conversation, but the quality of the silence after it was different from any silence they had shared before. October arrived, and the aspen on the high slopes were fully gold, and the double sea was deep in the work of preparation for winter. Cole rode the perimeter of his grazing land almost every day to check the state of the herd, and Hector and Bud were occupied with the endless repairs and reinforcements that a Colorado winter demanded. Eliza expanded her work into the preparations that sustained a household through the cold months: the careful organization of the root cellar, the management of the smoked and dried meats, the making of candles, and the maintaining of the lamp oil supply. On the second Saturday of October, the town of Harlan Creek held its autumn social, which was a semi-annual event that served both as a celebration and as the primary mechanism by which the scattered community kept itself connected. Agnes Rupert had told Eliza about it in September and had made clear, in the kindly but firm way Agnes made most things clear, that attendance was expected of anyone new to the area who wished to be properly a part of the community. Eliza asked Cole about it that Wednesday at supper. "The autumn social," he said, with the expression of a man who has known something unpleasant is coming and has been waiting for it to arrive. "Agnes mentioned it to you, I take it." "She did," Eliza said. "She mentioned it was something the whole area attended. Hector and Bud usually go," he said, carefully neutral. "I generally attend briefly." "I would like to go," she said simply, "if that's acceptable." "You don't need my permission," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been faint irritation directed, she thought, not at her but at himself for the awkwardness of the situation. "I only meant in terms of the timing," she said. "I'd need to arrange the cooking accordingly." "Leave something cold for supper," he said. "We'll go together. I'll take the wagon." The morning of the autumn social was brilliantly clear, the kind of October day that comes in the mountains like a gift. The sky, a deep, impossible blue, and the air cold enough to make your breath visible, but not so cold as to be uncomfortable. Eliza put on her best dress, which was dark green wool that she had made herself 2 winters before and still fit well, and she braided her dark hair and pinned it up and stood in front of the small square mirror in her room and looked at herself with the clear, unpretentious assessment of a woman who knows her own appearance without being invested in it in either a vain or a deprecating direction. She came downstairs to find Cole already at the table in what was clearly his formal attire: a dark brown jacket that fit him well, a clean white shirt, his hair combed, his face shaved. He looked different. Not unrecognizable, but as though the version of him she dealt with daily was a working drawing and this was the finished thing. He looked up when she came into the kitchen and then looked back at his coffee with a kind of deliberate carelessness that she noticed and filed away. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," she said. The drive into town took 40 minutes through countryside so beautiful, it made the silence between them feel appropriate rather than empty, the golden slopes rising on either side and the wagon track running straight and pale between them. Hector and Bud had ridden ahead on horseback, which left the wagon to the 2 of them, and Eliza sat beside Cole on the bench and watched the mountains and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was not quite happiness but was close to it, something more like rightness, like being in a place that fit. The social was held in the large barn behind the feed store, which had been cleared of its usual contents, and decorated with corn sheaves and late-season flowers and lanterns hung from the rafters on lengths of wire. There was a long table of food, and a man with a fiddle who played with tremendous enthusiasm if not perfect accuracy, and there were perhaps 60 or 70 people present, from weathered ranchers in their best clean clothes to small children chasing each other around the periphery. Agnes Rupert found Eliza within approximately 30 seconds of her arrival and introduced her to what felt like every woman in the Harlan Creek area in rapid and cheerful succession: Martha Hale, who ran the general store with her husband; Conception Reyes, Hector's wife; a warm-eyed woman with two small children on her hands, the parents' sisters, who were school teachers and looked it, and a dozen others whose names Eliza committed to memory with the automatic efficiency of a person who understood the value of knowing people. Cole, she noticed from across the room, had found the wall and was standing against it with a glass of cider, talking in a minimal way with a group of ranchers she didn't know, looking like a man who was present through a sense of duty and was managing that duty with stoic efficiency. At one point, a young woman named Clara Briggs, who was perhaps 20 and very pretty in a fresh, uncomplicated way, made her way to Cole's side of the room and spoke to him with considerable animation. And Eliza, who had been in the middle of a conversation with Conception Reyes about bread making, found her attention pulled in that direction with an immediacy that she immediately and sternly addressed. She had no claim on Cole Danvers. She was his housekeeper. This was the architecture of their situation, and she was not going to mistake it for anything else. She brought her full attention back to Conception and the conversation about bread, and did a thorough and effective job of keeping it there. Later in the evening, when the fiddle had been going for 2 hours and the dancing had evolved from the careful to the exuberant, she found Cole at her elbow. "You've met half the territory," he said, with something she now recognized as his version of dry humor, understated and very dry, almost invisible if you weren't listening for it. "Agnes Rupert is a very efficient introducer," she said. "She is," he agreed. He stood beside her and they watched the dancing for a moment, a square dance that the fiddle player had segued into, with a caller who shouted the figures over the music in a voice that had clearly been in use for many years. "Do you dance?" she asked, without entirely meaning to. He turned to look at her with that brief, assessing look. "Do you?" "I asked first," she pointed out. The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but the honest structural precursor to one. "I know the figures," he said. "I haven't danced in a while." "Neither have I," she said. The pause that followed lasted exactly long enough to become a question, and then he held out his hand and she took it, and they joined the set. He did know the figures. He was not a man who danced for pleasure or performance, but he moved through the patterns with a clean, practical competence that she found, for reasons she could not have articulated without embarrassment, deeply charming. She was a better dancer than he was, and they both knew it. And when the figures called for hands joined in turns, she made the transition smooth, and he followed her lead in those moments without any self-consciousness. And they got through the whole dance without collision or confusion. When it ended, they were both slightly out of breath, and she was laughing genuinely, not politely. At the moment in the final figure where he had steered her very firmly to avoid the parents' sisters who were executing their turns with the focused determination of people who had not been paying attention to the space they were occupying. He looked at her laughing, and something in his face loosened and opened in a way she had not seen before, something warm and unguarded, and he said, "The parents' sisters are a hazard." And then he smiled, a real one, a full one, and it completely changed the architecture of his face. Eliza felt something in her chest shift with an almost audible quality, like a key turning. She looked away. She looked at the dancing and the lanterns and the people she had met that evening, and she told herself with firm practicality that she had not come to the Double C looking for this, and that she was not going to let it be a problem. She was good at managing herself. She had years of practice. But the thing about feelings that have been well managed is that they tend to find the gaps in the management with a persistence that suggests they are not particularly interested in being organized. November came, and with it the first real snowfall, which blanketed the valley floor overnight and turned the Double C into a different kind of place, quieter and closer. The distances of the land compressed by the white that covered them, the mornings darker and the evenings longer, and the time spent indoors more pronounced. Eliza moved into the winter rhythm of the house with the same quiet competence she had brought to everything else, and the house was warm and well stocked and smelled of wood smoke and whatever was on the stove. In November, something happened that shifted things. It began with the arrival on a Wednesday morning of a man named Garrett Webb. Garrett Webb was a land agent. He was 35, well-dressed in the manner of town men who want to appear prosperous, and he arrived in a good buggy with a leather satchel on the seat beside him, and introduced himself to Cole in the yard with the particular brand of enthusiastic friendliness that almost always precedes an attempt to take something from you. Cole came inside at noon with a face that Eliza, who had learned to read his silences the way you learn to read weather, recognized immediately as the particular set that meant controlled anger. She set his lunch on the table and poured his coffee and did not ask, because she had learned that asking Cole Danvers a direct question when he had that face was like asking a river why it was running fast. He would get to it in his own time. He got to it that evening. "Garrett Webb wants to buy the Double C," he said, at supper. Hector and Bud had eaten and gone, and it was the two of them at the table in the early dark with the storm lantern burning. "He represents a company out of Denver that is acquiring land in the valley. He's made offers on 4 other properties in the area." "What did you tell him?" Eliza asked. "I told him no." He said it simply, but there was a weight under the simplicity that she heard very clearly. "He'll come back. Men like that always come back." "Is there anything that makes the situation precarious for you?" she asked carefully. "Any debt or obligation that might give him leverage?" He looked at her. "Why would you ask that?" "Because land agents who represent Denver companies do not come knocking without having done their research first," she said. "And research usually means looking for the crack in the wall." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The ranch is clear, no outstanding debt. The title is clean." He paused. "My issue is not legal. It's that Webb has been talking to my neighbors and 3 of them are considering his offer, and if he acquires enough of the valley acreage, he can effectively control the water rights to the creek that feeds this property." Eliza understood this immediately. "If he controls the water, he controls me," Cole said flatly. "Without the creek, the Double C can't function as a cattle ranch. The north pasture dries out in summer without the runoff." "Then the question," Eliza said, "is whether you can establish a legal water rights claim before he consolidates enough property to contest it." He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when she had surprised him. "You know about water law. I know that in this territory, water rights are established by prior appropriation, and that the first person to put the water to beneficial use has the senior right," she said. "I know that because when I was in Pueblo, I kept house for a lawyer for 8 months, and I read everything on his shelves that I could get my hands on. I know that I was his housekeeper and not his clerk, and I am not pretending otherwise, but I also know what I read." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I need to go to the county seat." "When?" "Before the ground freezes solid. 2 weeks, maybe 3. "I can manage the house for 3 days," she said. "Take Hector, take the relevant documents." He nodded, and there was something in the nod that was different from the usual. It was the nod of a man acknowledging a person, not just an arrangement. The following Saturday, something else happened that was smaller and more immediate and, in the accounting of things, more consequential. Eliza was in the study, dusting the bookshelves with the methodical care she gave to everything, when she took down the volume of Walt Whitman to dust behind it, and a folded letter fell out from between the pages. She picked it up, not intending to read it, but the letter was not sealed and it was old. The paper was soft with handling, and 2 lines were visible before she could fold it closed again. The 2 lines read, "I am sorry for what became of us. I think of you more than I have said." She folded the letter and set it back between the pages and put the book back on the shelf and finished dusting without reading a word more, because she was not that kind of person. But she thought about those 2 lines for the rest of the day. Not with the interested nosiness of someone piecing together someone else's story, but with the particular recognition of someone who understands, from the inside, what it is to love something and lose it and carry it in a book on a shelf and not quite be able to put it down. She said nothing about the letter. She never mentioned it. That evening, Cole came in from the barn and she was at the kitchen table going over the supply lists, and he said without preamble, "I used to be engaged in Tennessee, before I came west." He said it the way you say a thing you have been deciding to say for longer than the conversation has been happening. She chose someone else. Someone with better prospects at the time. He was looking at the wall, not at her. "I don't say this to be pitied. I say it because you are a perceptive woman and I believe you have been wondering, and because it is relevant to why I am the way I am in this house." Eliza set down her pen. "You don't owe me an explanation." "I know I don't," he said. "I am offering one anyway." She looked at him for a moment. "I appreciate it," she said. He looked at her then directly. "I am not a man who is easy to know," he said. "I am aware of that." "No," she agreed, "but that's not the same as being not worth knowing." The silence that followed was the longest and the fullest they had shared, and he held her gaze for a moment, just a moment, before he looked down at the table and said, quietly, "Good night, Eliza," for the first time using her first name without the formality of her surname, and went upstairs. She sat in the kitchen for a while after he had gone up, with the supply lists forgotten in front of her, and the fire in the stove ticking and settling, and thought about a man who had carried a letter in a book of poems for some indeterminate number of years, and had just, quietly, begun to let it go. She thought about herself, which she did less often than she thought about everything else, and admitted, in the privacy of her own mind, that she was in some measure of trouble. December arrived. Cole made his trip to the county seat with Hector, taking the relevant land documents and returning 3 days later with a filed water rights claim that the county recorder had registered in his name as prior appropriationist. It was not a complete resolution of the Webb situation, but it was a solid legal foundation, and Cole came back with the particular quality of a man who has dealt with a problem properly and is not done with it but has moved it to a different position. Garrett Webb came to the Double C one more time in the second week of December, and Cole met him in the yard, and the conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, and when Eliza watched from the kitchen window, she saw Webb leave without the satisfied expression he had arrived with, and Cole come into the house with a clarity about him that looked like resolution. "He'll be back in the spring," Cole said, washing his hands at the kitchen sink, "but not with the same leverage." "Good," Eliza said, and meant it. Christmas at the Double C came quietly and without a great deal of ceremony, which suited both of them in different ways. Eliza made a proper Christmas supper, roasted beef and biscuits, and a dried apple pie with a crust that Hector declared the finest he had eaten in his life, which made Bud snort in Conception, who had come out for the dinner with her 2 children, accept the compliment on Eliza's behalf with the particular grace of a woman who has absolute confidence in her own cooking and is also genuinely generous. After supper, with the children asleep on the parlor floor and Bud smoking on the porch and Hector and Conception talking quietly by the fire, Eliza was in the kitchen cleaning up when Cole came in and set a small, flat package on the table beside her. She looked at it, and then at him. "For Christmas," he said, with the slightly stiff quality of a man who has done something that required courage and is not going to admit that it did. She dried her hands and opened it. Inside was a book, a copy of Jane Austen's Emma, the cover worn at the corners, the pages clearly read. She looked up at him. "I noticed you had read everything in the study worth reading," he said, which was not an explanation but was the best available substitute. "That one is good." "I know it," she said. "I have read it, but I don't own a copy." "You do now," he said. She looked at the book and then at him, and felt the thing in her chest that she had been managing with such careful diligence press against its management with something approaching insistence. "Thank you, Cole," she said, and she said his name the way he had said hers, simply, without the formality, and it sat between them in the warm kitchen like something true. He cleared his throat and picked up the coffee pot and poured himself a cup and said, "The apple pie was exceptional," which was the most praise he had offered about any food in the 3 months she had been there, and she smiled at her new book and did not push. January in the San Juan Valley was cold in the way that makes everything else seem like a memory of warmth. The deep, structural cold of high mountain country, the kind that comes in at the window cracks and settles into the bones of the house. The days were short and brilliant, the snow on the surrounding peaks catching the low sun and throwing it back in a silver light that was beautiful and unforgiving at the same time. They had fallen into a pattern by January, she and Cole, that was more than the pattern of employer and employee, but had not become anything else, at least not formally. They ate supper together most evenings after Hector and Bud had gone, not by any stated arrangement, but simply because neither of them seemed to find a reason not to. He read sometimes in the front room while she mended or wrote the household accounts, and occasionally one of them would read something aloud, a piece of news from the weekly paper that came from Denver, or a passage from a book. He had read her a passage from Moby Dick one evening in January, the chapter about the whiteness of the whale, and his reading voice was low and measured, and she had sat listening with her mending in her lap and had thought, clearly and simply, "I am in love with this man. I have been for some time." She sat with this knowledge the way you sit with a piece of information that will require action eventually, but cannot be acted on in the immediate moment. She turned it over. She examined it without sentimentality. She asked herself whether it was real or whether it was the product of close proximity and the particular intensity of life in an isolated place in winter. And she concluded, honestly, that it was both. That proximity had been the occasion, but that the content was real and specific to him in particular, to his carefulness and his unexpected humor, and the way he moved through the world with a particular quality of attention. The way he had filed the water rights claim and stacked the wood by the kitchen hearth and placed the Christmas book on the table beside her. She also concluded with the same honesty that she did not know what he felt and that she was not going to presume or maneuver. She was in his house under a specific arrangement, and she had her own dignity to consider, and she would not make the situation complicated unless there was some clear reason to believe that complication was welcome. She kept this knowledge inside herself like a lantern inside a room with the curtains drawn, warm and contained, visible only from very close. February brought something she had not anticipated. It began with a letter for Eliza, delivered by the mail rider on the first Friday of the month, from a woman named Dorothea Hale, who was the wife of a wealthy rancher in New Mexico Territory. Dorothea had heard of Eliza through the network of women who pass information about competent housekeepers, the way merchants pass information about reliable suppliers, and she was writing to offer a position significantly better paid than her current one, in a larger house, with more responsibilities and what Dorothea described as a proper staff beneath her, effectively making her a housekeeper in the senior, managerial sense. It was a good offer. It was, by any practical measure, a better offer than her current situation. Eliza read the letter twice, carefully, and then folded it and put it in her dress pocket and went about the day's work and did not think about it, because not thinking about it was a way of allowing herself to feel what she actually felt about it before she engaged with it rationally. What she felt about it was that she did not want to go. This was clear and immediate and not complicated by any amount of practical analysis. She did not want to leave the Double C. She did not want to leave the kitchen and the root cellar she had organized, and the garden she had put down for the spring, and the curtains she had put up, and the painting above the mantelpiece. She did not want to leave Hector and Conception, who had become real friends. She did not want to leave the evenings in the front room or the winter mornings when the stove was warm and the eastern pasture was white and everything was quiet. She did not want to leave Cole Danvers, who she loved. She thought about this for 3 days. She was not a woman who made decisions quickly when the stakes were real. She thought about it with the full, honest force of her intelligence and her experience and her understanding of her own nature, and at the end of 3 days, she had reached 2 conclusions. The first was that she would not take the New Mexico position. The second was that this decision was one she was making for herself, independently of anything Cole felt or didn't feel, because staying in a place because of an unrequited feeling was not the same as making a genuine choice, and she was only making a genuine choice if she was prepared to stay knowing that the feeling might never be returned. She wrote to Dorothea Hale and declined the position with thanks. She did this on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen, while Cole was out checking the north pasture fence, and she sealed the letter and addressed it and set it on the table to go with the next mail rider, and felt the particular clarity of a decision fully made. She had not told Cole about the letter. The following Saturday evening, they were in the front room after supper, a practice that had, without formal acknowledgement, become their norm. The fire was well up, and the room had the deep warmth of a properly insulated space in a cold month, and Eliza was reading Emma for the third time in her life, but the first time in this house, and Cole was going over some papers related to the cattle inventory. The wind was up outside, rattling the window panes with intermittent purpose. Cole looked up from his papers. "You have been different this week," he said. She looked up from her book. "Different how?" He set the papers down and looked at her with the directness he rarely deployed, but which, when he did, had the quality of a clear sky, nothing between you and it. "Quieter. And you have been looking at the house differently. The way people look at things they are calculating whether to leave." The precision of this observation was so accurate that she felt her breath momentarily catch. She looked at him steadily. "I received a letter," she said. "A position in New Mexico. A better one in practical terms." He was very still. "Are you going to take it?" "No," she said. "I already declined." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his face, something that she watched carefully because it was there, and then composed again before she could fully read it. "Why did you decline it?" It was a direct question, and the directness of it met the directness of her own nature, and she set Emma face down in her lap and said, "Because I am content here. This house, these people, this place. I would rather stay." "Eliza," he said, and the way he said it, quietly, with the full weight of his attention, made everything in the room feel very still and very present. "Yes," she said. He set his papers on the side table and leaned forward with his forearms on his knees and looked at her with those dark eyes and said, "I am not good at this. I want to be clear about that up front. I have been, by general agreement including my own, not good at it for most of my adult life." Her heart was doing something loud and unruly inside her chest that she hoped was not audible. "At what specifically?" she asked, because clarity seemed important. "At saying what I mean when what I mean is—" He stopped. He pressed his hands together and looked at the fire for a moment and then looked at her again. "I think about you constantly," he said simply. "I have since October. Possibly before October. I have been handling this by not saying anything, which is my general approach to everything that matters to me, and I have begun to understand that it is a poor approach and that I should say something before you leave for New Mexico or somewhere else entirely." "I told you I already declined," she said. "I know you did," he said. "And I am saying this anyway, because you should hear it regardless of what you decided, because you should know that you are valued here by more than your cooking and your household management, which are excellent, and that what you said that first autumn evening about a home feeling like somebody lives in it has stayed with me, and that the person I think of when I think of this house now is you, and that this is the most I have said to another human being in approximately 3 years. And I would appreciate it if you did not use it against me." There was something in his voice under the directness and the formal grammar that was simply, nakedly, a kind of vulnerability she had not expected from him, and it moved her completely. She crossed the front room in 3 steps and sat in the chair beside his, not at her usual distance but close, their knees almost touching, and she said, "Cole Danvers, I am in love with you. I have been for some time. I was not going to say so because I was not going to presume. But you have asked in your particular way, and so I am telling you plainly." He looked at her for a moment in the firelight with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was something open and unguarded and warm, something that looked like relief and wonder at the same time. Then he reached out and took her hand very carefully and held it in both of his and said, "I don't deserve that." "That is not your assessment to make," she said. "It's mine." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, the kind you make when you have been carrying something heavy for a long time and have just been told you can set it down. He bent his head and pressed his lips to the back of her hand, briefly and gently, and when he looked up there was something in his eyes that made the lantern behind curtains feeling inside her throw open every window. "I realize," he said, "that I have handled this very badly and very late." "You handled it eventually," she said. "That counts for something." He smiled, the full smile she had first seen at the autumn social, the one that changed the architecture of his face. "Eliza," he said, "I would like to court you properly, with your permission." She looked at him for a moment, at this careful, contained, private man who had just done the most uncontained and unprivate thing she had ever seen him do, and said, "You have it." What followed was a courtship that had the particular quality of something happening between two adults who know themselves, deliberate and warm and full of the kind of specific, particular attentions that are more meaningful than grand gestures, because they demonstrate that one person has been paying very close attention to another. He began, the morning after the conversation in the front room, by sitting down to breakfast with her before Hector and Bud were up and drinking his coffee and talking, actually talking, about himself, about Tennessee and the woman and the years between, about what he had wanted the Double C to be when he had bought it, and what it had actually become in the solitude of working it alone. He talked in the measured, careful way of someone who has a great deal to say and is only just learning that saying it is safe. And she listened with the full, warm attention that she gave to everything that mattered, and asked questions that showed she was genuinely interested, and he watched her ask them with something in his face that she recognized now as what it had always been. She told him things too. She told him about Walsenburg and her parents, her father's slow decline from the lung sickness that afflicted so many of the men who worked the land in the hard way, her mother's absolute unbroken dignity through it all, the way she had kept a home with almost nothing and made it feel, for all its hardness, like a place worth coming back to. She told him about the years of service and what she had learned from them and what she had given up and what she had kept. She told him that she had loved before, once, a young man in a limosa who had been kind, and then unkind in the specific way of people who discover that loving someone poor requires a sustained effort they had not anticipated. Cole listened to this last part with his jaw set in a way she now knew well and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "He was a fool," with such precise and unadorned conviction that she laughed, and the tension of the telling dissolved, and they finished breakfast with the feeling of people who have exchanged something real. He found small, considered ways to show her what she meant to him. He fixed the sticking drawer on the kitchen sideboard without being asked. He came in from a ride one afternoon in early March and brought her a handful of the first wildflowers he had seen on the south slope, not romantic flowers, just the tough, early ones, the ones that come up through the last snow, and set them on the kitchen table without ceremony and said, "Found these," and hung up his coat and went to wash. And she stood holding the small, rough bunch and felt her heart do something enormous and quiet. He walked with her in the evenings when the weather allowed, along the fence lines and down to the creek and out to the far edge of the home pasture, and these walks had a quality she associated with very few things in her life, the quality of time that is being spent exactly right, not waiting for something better or mourning something past, but simply present in what is, completely and with full attention. In late March, on a Sunday, he asked her to marry him. He did not do it dramatically. He was not a dramatic man. They were in the kitchen garden, which was just beginning to show the first tentative promise of the seeds she had planted in the fall, and he was helping her clear the dead material from the previous year's beds, which was not particularly romantic, but was the kind of shared, quiet work that had come to characterize their time together. He was working with his back to her for a moment, and then he turned and said, simply and directly, looking at her with those dark, steady eyes, "I want to marry you, Eliza. I want you to stay here as more than my housekeeper. I want you to stay as my wife. I want to build something with you. I am asking you if you will." She stood in the kitchen garden with the March wind moving through her hair and the mountains behind him, and looked at this man she had come to know and love in all his quiet, particular complexity, and said, "Yes, Cole, I will." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and took her face in his hands, his rough, work-worn, careful hands, and kissed her. And it was the kind of kiss that has a whole winter's worth of held-back feeling in it and does not try to be anything other than exactly what it is. They were married in April, when the valley was greening and the creek was running high, and the aspen on the lower slopes were coming out in that fresh, luminous green that makes everything look like it is being seen for the first time. Agnes Rupert organized the wedding with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything, and the ceremony was held in the small white church with the peeling paint and the whole of the Harlan Creek community in attendance, because the whole of Harlan Creek had watched, with varying degrees of investment, as the woman who had come to the Double C as a housekeeper had become, over one winter, the person around whom Cole Danvers had reorganized himself. Hector Reyes stood up beside Cole, straight and dignified, and Conception stood beside Eliza, and the 2 children sat in the front pew with flowers in their hair because Eliza had put them there and they had not objected. Agnes Rupert cried, noisily and happily, from the 3rd row. Bud Ferris, to no one's great surprise, looked uncomfortable in his good clothes but clapped with genuine warmth when the minister pronounced them married. Cole held her hand throughout the ceremony with a firmness that she felt in her whole arm, as though he was making absolutely certain of something. And when the minister said he could kiss his bride, he kissed her with the same quality as the first kiss in the kitchen garden, present and specific and real. And she heard Agnes Rupert produce a sob of unambiguous joy. The months that followed were, in the accounting of Eliza's life, the fullest and the truest she had lived. The Double C in the summer of their first married year was a different place from the one she had arrived at the previous August. Not structurally different, not in any way that a visitor could precisely identify, but different in its quality of life, in the feeling of it, in the dailiness of 2 people who have chosen each other moving through a shared space with the particular ease of genuine compatibility. She continued to run the household, because it was work she was good at, and it was work the ranch required, but it was no longer the circumscribed role of an employee, and had become the broader, more complex activity of a woman managing her own home with full authority and genuine investment. She planted more in the kitchen garden and started a proper herb garden against the south wall of the house, which caught the sun and by midsummer smelled of rosemary and thyme in a way that made the yard feel like something she had always imagined. Cole expanded the herd by 12 head in the spring, a careful, considered expansion of exactly the kind that a man makes when he is thinking about the future rather than just the present, and he and Hector built a new corral and repaired the barn roof and talked about putting up a 3rd outbuilding before the next winter. Garrett Webb came in April, as Cole had predicted, and this time he brought a lawyer from Denver who was not as good a lawyer as he thought he was. Cole had prepared for this with the thoroughness of a man who has been thinking about it all winter, and he met Webb in town at the county recorder's office with his own documentation and his water rights filing and a clear account of his position, and Webb's lawyer found, to his visible frustration, that there was no legal angle available to him. Webb made one final offer of cash purchase that Cole declined without ceremony, and Webb drove his good buggy back toward the main road with the expression of a man who has been handled and knows it. Cole came home from town that evening with a bottle of good whiskey and told her what had happened, and she poured 2 glasses, and they sat on the porch in the April evening and drank the whiskey and watched the light go off the mountains. And she put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her and said, quietly, "It's done." "It's done," she agreed. In June, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen, in the morning, before Hector and Bud were up, the way she had learned to tell him anything important, in the quiet, early time that was theirs before the day's requirements arrived. She said it simply and directly, because that was how she said everything, and she watched his face with the particular attention she had been paying to it for nearly a year. What happened to his face was complete. The composure that was so habitual to him came undone in the best possible way, and for a moment he looked entirely unguarded and undone and young, and then he stood up from the table and came to her and took her hands and said, "Are you certain?" "I am certain," she said. He held her hands for a moment and then pulled her against him and held her with the careful, encompassing quality of a man who understands that he is holding something enormously important, and she felt his heart going at a pace she had never felt from him before, fast and present and alive, and she closed her eyes and held him back. "A baby," he said into her hair. "A baby," she confirmed. He made a sound that was the fully realized version of the almost laugh she had heard from him in February, the sound of a man in genuine, uncomplicated happiness, and held her tighter, and she laughed too, her face against his shoulder. And outside the kitchen window the June morning was doing extraordinary things in gold and green, and the creak was audible from the open door. The autumn of 1875 came and went, and on the 18th of November, Eliza delivered their son. She was assisted by the midwife from Harlan Creek, a competent and warm woman named Frances Adler, who had delivered half the children in the valley, and by Conception Reyes, who held Eliza's hand and talked to her steadily and warmly through the hours of labor with the practical encouragement of someone who had done this herself twice. Cole waited in the front room below, and Hector waited with him, because Hector was a good man who understood that this was not a moment for Cole to be alone, and they drank coffee and said almost nothing, and listened to the sounds from above, and Cole sat with his forearms on his knees and his hands clasped, and the look of a man undergoing something very serious. When Frances Adler came to the top of the staircase and called down that it was a boy and that they were both well, Cole was on his feet before she had finished the sentence and up the stairs in the time it takes to describe it. Eliza was sitting up in bed with the lamp warm and low beside her and their son in her arms, and the baby was a solid, red-faced, entirely opinionated individual who was voicing his arrival with considerable force. She looked up at Cole when he came through the door, and his face, she thought, was the most open she had ever seen it, open and undone and full to the edge with something that had no practical name. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she turned so he could see the baby fully, and he looked at his son for a long moment, and then looked at her with those dark eyes full of something she had no doubt about at all. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly, as if they were already in a private conversation. "We've been waiting for you." They named him James after Cole's father, who had died some years before, and whose memory Cole held with the complicated tenderness of a man who had complicated feelings about home and had never entirely resolved them. It was Eliza who had suggested the name, in one of their evening conversations in the winter before the baby was born, when Cole had mentioned his father in the careful, peripheral way he mentioned things that mattered. Cole had looked at her for a moment when she suggested it, and then looked at his hands and said, "Yes, I'd like that." James Danvers came into the world loudly and lived loudly, which was a quality neither of his parents had in full measure, and which they found together, both exhausting and enormously entertaining. He was a dark-haired, bright-eyed, physically relentless small person who seemed to have arrived with a complete conviction that the world existed for his investigation, and who greeted each new day with the enthusiasm of someone who has just received excellent news. Hector and Conception's children, Miguel and Rosa, who were 7 and 5 by this point, adopted James with immediate and proprietary warmth, and the Double C, which had for 3 years been a purely working place, and then for one winter had become a household, became now something that was specifically and undeniably a home. Cole and Eliza had, in the 18 months since their marriage, developed a partnership that was as practical as it was loving, which was to say that it was entirely practical and entirely loving, and they had found, to neither of their great surprise, that these things were not opposites. She managed the household and the accounts with the intelligence and competence she had always brought to work, and her role had expanded, with Cole's full support and genuine interest, to include the correspondence with the Denver cattle buyers who came each year to negotiate prices, which she handled with a directness and acumen that consistently produced better prices than the previous year. A fact that Hector regarded with unambiguous admiration and Bud Ferris regarded with an expression that had gradually, over the 2 years she had been on the Double C, moved from suspicion to something close to grudging respect. Cole had, over those 18 months, undergone a change that the people of Harlan Creek observed with the pleased attention of a community that takes genuine interest in the private developments of its members. He had not become less private, exactly, or less contained in his manner. These were his essential characteristics, and she had never asked them to be otherwise, but the quality of the containment was different. He laughed more. He was present in town in a way he had not been before, not constantly but regularly, coming in with Eliza on supply days, and stopping to talk on the street in a way he had previously avoided. He had, in short, the look of a man who has found the life he had not known how to want. One evening in the second winter, with James asleep in the small bedroom that had been the storage room, and was now papered with a simple pattern that Eliza had done herself with a cut potato and a tin of ink, and the house settled into its winter quiet, Cole came into the kitchen where Eliza was reading and sat across the table from her and said, without any particular prelude, "I want you to know something." She looked up from her book. "What?" "You arrived here," he said. "I had been living in this house for 3 years, and I had not in 3 years felt anything I could honestly call contentment. I was managing. I was working and building something which is a kind of purpose, but there was no—" He paused. He looked for the word. There was no warmth in it. It was like building a fire in an empty fireplace and standing in the cold and looking at it. She was very still. "I didn't know what I was missing," he said. "That's the honest truth. I had been alone long enough that I had forgotten that anything was missing. And you came here as my housekeeper, and you put up curtains and planted things and cooked meals, and I sat across from you at supper and found that the house had become somewhere I wanted to be in the evenings." He looked at her steadily. "I understood very late what was happening, too late in the sense that I had already—" Another pause. "You had already become something I could not imagine being without before I had even spoken honestly about it." Eliza set her book down. She said, "You did say something eventually." "Only because I was terrified you would go to New Mexico," he said, and the honesty of this, the plain, unarguable truth of it, made her chest fill with something warm and enormous. "I was not going to go to New Mexico," she said. "You might have," he said, "if I had left it longer." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, at his angular face and his dark eyes and the particular quality of his expression, when he was most truly himself, open in the specific way that he was only open with her. The composed, private man putting down, very deliberately, the composure and the privacy because she was the person he trusted with what was underneath. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "You realized in time," she said. "Barely," he said. "In time," she said firmly. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that in the quiet kitchen with the fire burning and the wind in the eaves and their son asleep upstairs, and the Double C settled around them with the particular presence of a place that is fully alive. Spring came to the valley with its usual dramatic beauty, the snowmelt filling the creek and the meadows going from white to brown to a green so vivid it seemed impossible, And the double C expanded again that spring Cole bought the adjacent 40 acres from a homesteader named Elliott Park, who was moving his family to Oregon. And this addition consolidated the ranch's water access in a way that permanently and conclusively resolved the Garrett Webb concern. Webb, they heard through the Harlan Creek grapevine, had encountered similar water rights obstacles on 2 other properties he had been attempting to acquire, and had shifted his company's attention to land farther north, which suited the entire valley perfectly. The spring also brought a letter from a woman named Eliza Calloway, who turned out to be Eliza's mother's second cousin, recently widowed and looking for a situation. Eliza read this letter with an expression Cole had learned to recognize as the one she wore when she was working through something carefully, and at supper she said, "There is a woman who is family to me who is alone and looking for work. She is 52 and I believe she is a good person, though I have not seen her since I was a child." Cole looked at her. "What would you need? She could help with the house, which has become more than one person can manage properly with James in it. She could take the room above the kitchen, which is still empty since I moved downstairs." "Write to her," he said simply. Eliza Calloway arrived in June, a small, brisk woman with Eliza's dark eyes and a manner that suggested considerable experience with getting on with things, and she integrated into the double C with the calm efficiency of someone who had worked hard all her life and knew exactly what was required of her and how to do it. She and Eliza established an immediate warm alliance, the kind that forms between women who respect each other's competence and have a genuine affection underlying it. And the house ran with a smoothness that left Eliza more time for the accounts and the cattle negotiations and the garden, and primarily her son. James, at 8 months old, was mobile in the determined, unstoppable way of certain small people, and the kitchen contained several new latches on cupboard doors that had not previously required them. In the summer of 1876, when James was just past 6 months old and the Colorado Centennial celebrations were bringing a new energy to the whole territory, Eliza discovered she was pregnant again. She told Cole on the porch in the evening, the way she had told him the first time, simply and directly. He had been sitting in one of the straight-backed porch chairs watching the last light on the mountains, and she came and sat beside him and said, "We're going to have another one." He looked at her and then looked at the mountains and then looked at her again, and the smile that came over his face was slower this time and deeper, the smile of a man for whom happiness has become familiar enough to be received rather than just felt. "When?" he asked. "February, I think," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken it in the front room on that February evening 18 months before, and held it with the same careful firmness. And they sat on the porch of the Double C in the summer evening and watched the last gold leave the peaks and the stars appear over the valley one by one. And the house behind them was warm with lamplight and the sound of Sarah reading to James in the kitchen. And the land around them was the land they had built something on together. And it was entirely and completely theirs. Their daughter was born in February of 1877, on a night when the temperature dropped to the coldest it had been all winter, and the stars outside the bedroom window were the particularly brilliant kind that only come on the coldest nights, as though the cold clarifies everything. Frances Adler delivered her with the same competent warmth she had brought to James's arrival, and conception was there again. And this time Cole sat on the edge of the bed within minutes of the birth with a different kind of certainty than the first time, holding his daughter in his arms with the careful, overwhelmed look of a man who has learned from experience how to be present in an enormous moment. They named her Ruth, after Eliza's mother, who had died the previous autumn in Walsenburg at the age of 61, having lived her whole life with great dignity and very little material reward. Eliza had gone to Walsenburg when she heard her mother was ill, and Cole had driven her to the rail junction at Pueblo and put her on the train with the careful, quiet attentiveness he gave to all serious things. And she had held her mother's hand in the last days and come home to the Double C 3 weeks later with her grief folded into herself in the way she had learned from her mother, not suppressed but held, carefully, and with respect. Cole had been waiting on the porch when the wagon brought her back from the junction, and he had come down the steps and held her without saying anything, and she had let herself be held, which was something she had not allowed herself in many years, and cried properly for the first time. Ruth was, from her first week in the world, a person of great serenity and focused observation, which made her the temperamental opposite of her brother and the temperamental mirror of her father. And Cole held her in the evenings in the front room with an expression of complete contentment that Eliza memorized as one of the best things she had ever seen. James, at 15 months, regarded his sister with a careful, assessing curiosity that reminded Eliza powerfully of Cole watching her come through the gate on the borrowed mule that first August morning, and she laughed about this privately and later told Cole. And he laughed too, the full, genuine laugh that she had worked so hard to earn and now heard every day. The spring of 1877 was generous and clear, the kind of Colorado spring that makes everything possible seem actually possible, and the Double C was a working, living, fully inhabited thing. Hector Ray's had become, in the years since Eliza's arrival, something between a ranch hand and a partner, a development that Cole had formalized with a percentage arrangement that Hector had accepted with quiet dignity and conception, had celebrated with a supper that lasted most of an evening. Bud Ferris had moved on the previous fall, taking a position at a larger outfit to the north, and the young man who had replaced him, a 19-year-old named Thomas Crane, who had walked in off the mountain road looking for work and turned out to be a natural with horses, had settled into the ranch with the easy adaptability of youth and was, by spring, as much a part of the place as the corrals. The cattle herd was 43 head and growing correctly. The house was full and warm and functional and beautiful in the particular, specific way of a house that is loved by the people who live in it. The kitchen garden covered twice the ground it had when Eliza first arrived, and the herb garden against the south wall had expanded into a proper medicinal garden that Frances Adler, the midwife, had visited twice with her medical notebook to document. Eliza stood in that garden one April morning, Ruth on her hip and James running in the yard with Hector's boy Miguel, and looked at the Double C in the particular, clear-eyed way she had looked at things all her life, and thought about the woman who had arrived here on a borrowed mule with a carpet bag, and a letter of employment and a clear-eyed, practical view of her own prospects. She thought about the man who had come out of the barn and said, "You're the housekeeper," and turned and walked toward the house, and the room with the morning light, and the curtain she had hung, and the painting above the mantelpiece, and the firewood by the kitchen hearth that had appeared one morning as an acknowledgment, and the autumn social and the dance and the winter evenings in the front room and the passage from Moby Dick read aloud, and the letter in the book of poems and the Christmas book and the February conversation, and the kitchen garden in March and the proposal, and the wedding in April and everything after, all the dailiness and the difficulty and the beauty of a life, shared with a person who was specifically and entirely right. Cole came around the corner of the house from the direction of the North Corral, his hat in his hand and his face open in the morning light the way it was open now, naturally and habitually, the composure present but not sealed, the private quiet present but inhabited, the difference between an empty room and a room full of the things and the warmth that make it mean something. He stopped when he saw her standing in the garden with Ruth and looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 2 years, which was to say with his whole face and without any management of it at all, the dark eyes direct and warm and entirely present. "You look pleased about something," he said. "I am pleased about a great many things," she said. He came across the yard and stopped in front of her and took Ruth from her hip and held his daughter against his shoulder, and Ruth grabbed his collar with her small, firm hand and looked at him with her father's dark eyes and her mother's directness, and he looked at Eliza over the top of their daughter's head and said, in the quiet, present voice she loved best. "So am I." She reached up and straightened the collar of his shirt where Ruth's fist had crumpled it, and he caught her hand and held it there, pressed flat against his chest above his heart. And the April morning went on around them, James shouting with delight across the yard, the mountains holding their snow against the blue sky, the creek audible from the south and the cattle moving in the distant pasture, the herb garden smelling of rosemary and new growth, and the particular freshness of a season that keeps its promises. This was the double C in the spring of their second full year together, and it was whole. Later that evening, after the children were asleep and Sarah had gone quietly to her room and Hector had walked Conception, and the children back to their house across the yard, Cole and Eliza sat on the porch in the spring dark in the two straight-back chairs that had been there since before she arrived, the same chairs, worn smoother now, and the lantern was warm beside them and the sky was the deep, clear kind that the mountains make. "I have been thinking," Cole said after a while. "About what?" she asked. "About the fact that a year after I bought this ranch, I was certain I knew exactly what kind of place it was and what it was for and what my life here was going to look like," he said. "And I was completely wrong about all of it." "Were you?" she said. "Yes," he said. "I thought it was a working ranch. I thought my life in it was going to be work and order and productive solitude." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark hills. "I thought I was the kind of man who did not need more than that. And the fact that I was wrong about that is," he paused, "the best thing I have ever been wrong about." Eliza looked at him in the lantern light, at his profile and his hands and the easy, present quality of him, and felt the fullness of everything, her work and her children and her home and this man who had come out of a barn 3 years ago and said, "You're the housekeeper," and meant it as a statement of fact, and had discovered, too late and exactly in time, that the fact had become something else entirely. "You realized it eventually," she said. "You keep saying that," he said. "Because it keeps being true," she said. He looked at her then and reached over, and took her hand from the arm of her chair, and held it in his the way he had been holding it in one form or another since that February evening, and she held his back, and the double sea settled into its night quiet around them, complete and fully alive, and every thread of it tied, and nothing left unresolved, and the mountains standing as they had always stood over the valley, patient and permanent and entirely indifferent to the small, specific, enormous happiness of the two people on the porch below.